Tony D and little Joan in the background in the sunbeam somewhere, lying out front. And this, I guess you'd call it a hot take, responding to one of Carl's videos, which I thought was interesting. He did this video called My Fall, quote unquote, from Liberalism. And he gets into a lot of issues here and a bit of a layman, so forgive me and my simple terminology, but I'm going to respond to it as best I can. Smash like and subscribe. Thank you for smash liking and subscribing. Check out my books, The Pineys, books 1 through 18, soon to be 19, waiting for the copyright. Also, don't forget the live stream tonight at 7. So you can ask me about this if you want to get into this. So Carl is considers himself a post-liberal, and my understanding of that is this: liberalism in the UK is like basically communism at this point. I think the liberals in the UK are much further left than the ones in America. At least that's my impression. And like a lot of English commentators on YouTube, a lot of Carl's political commentary goes back to one thing, which is immigration. Immigration's completely out of control in the UK and Europe in general, has been for a long time. And since they're much smaller countries, they can't absorb these people. They just can't. Now, in the United States, we have taken a ton of people, but we absorbed quite a few of them. We're such a big country, we kind of can. So, some of the people being deported are basically integrated Americans to a large extent, but they didn't do the right thing in terms of the paperwork, and they have to go. They have to go. Or they have to somehow fix their legal situation. But this isn't about the United States and immigration, although Carl sort of bleeds into that. And what he's talking about, I think, is morality and how the concept of liberalism doesn't really dictate morality. But in that sort of critique and why he's not a liberal anymore, and this article basically throws Carl into a group that he doesn't consider himself really in that group, post-liberals who look to be a bit of a danger, I think, is what the article is implying. He seems to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the phrase. So what he says is liberalism, the world liberalism as a project has failed. And one of the things he cites is the grooming gangs and immigration, and they're pretty tied in. And he blames that on the liberal world order, that the philosophy of liberalism has led to the inevitable conclusion. Now, he also says in the same critique that, and again, layman, liberals sort of are statist, I think he would say. He didn't say that, but I'm concluding that. They're very much a worship of the state. They would like the state to rule over everything. And that as long as you follow the rules, anything else outside the morals is fine. And I think this is where he gets hung up, because the rules in a liberal world order or in a democracy, and I think he's conflating like philosophy with the politics, and the morality. The liberals didn't ignore, which I believe it's 83% of the UK doesn't want a lot of immigration or much of it at all anymore. They want to limit it. I believe that was the stat. A lot of people in the UK, especially now, don't want tons of immigration. They didn't even want it when Tony Blair initially started this project of opening the borders up and flooding the country with immigrants. That to me is a complete break of the rules, right? Because the rules state you have a representative government, and the government is supposed to represent you and do what you want. The people of the UK didn't want all this immigration. Therefore, the government is corrupt. It's a corrupt government. And I think that he would agree with that assessment. And it doesn't matter, which sort of political party was in the UK, because the Tories did it. Now, he would call them also liberals, but just liberals going at the speed limit. I would just call them more corrupt politicians. Their philosophy doesn't really matter. They're not doing this for their philosophy, in my opinion. I think the people at the echelons of power are doing it for one reason. The leftist protesters they're the virtue signalers. They're the ones that are caught up in the philosophy because they don't have any power to actually change things. If they had power to change things, they would try to change it and probably course correct when they saw, oh, this isn't working at all. If they wanted a particular goal, which was to, make people in the UK happy, they would quickly say, oh, this isn't making people happy at all. And I got everything I wanted because I'm powerful. No, the leftist protesters are not powerful at all. I think that's why they protest. Because, number one, they feel helpless. And number two, they've been misled by the media. Now, the people in the echelons of power are the ones misleading them because they tell the media, hey, we want everybody to be on board with letting in the immigrants, so here's what we're going to say. But why do they want to let in the immigrants in the UK and elsewhere? Well, I think that comes outside of your country's politics. It comes from the globalists, who are the neo-communists or communists, and they want all that immigration for money, monetarily speaking. And some of that, I guess you could say, is their philosophy. But I think it's mostly money. The idea being is you're going to flood a country with so many immigrants, and those immigrants don't have a lot of powers. Some of them don't even have full citizenship. They're completely dependent upon the state because you bring them in and immediately give them gibs, as they call them in the Lotus Eaters, various, I'm going to just move this a little bit just to make it look different. You give them various welfare, and they are instantly used to the state's beneficence. But how do you say it? The state's largesse. And all you have to do is keep them on that for a generation. Well, what are their kids going to be? Well, normally I get the check from the government, and then I sit around all day and play video games and get high. And making them completely dependent upon the state. And then, politically, those people are also completely dependent upon the people handing out the money. It's the same philosophy that infected America with the Democrats. The Democrats saying, oh, well, we'll bring in a bunch of immigrants, illegal aliens, give them all sorts of benefits that they don't have in their home country. Not quite as bad as it is in the UK, but similar here. And then they'll become our voters. So, what was the response here? Well, the response was to elect Donald Trump and have Donald Trump kick all these people out of the country as best we can. That's what's happening now. Unfortunately, the response in the UK was to elect the Tories, who made it worse, and then elect Labour, who is making it 10 times worse. In the UK, both your parties are completely corrupt, like completely. Well, there's more than two parties, but they all seem pretty corrupt from where I'm sitting. But it's about money, because the people in that upper echelon of government are all making money on this somehow. Whether it's, there are hedge funds and investment groups, and they're making money not directly on one particular company, but a series of companies who are making money. So part of these companies are construction companies who are, in New Jersey, they're building houses and warehouses like you wouldn't believe. I wish it would stop. It's not going to stop, by the way, because of our last election, because of the people who suddenly ended up on the voter rolls here. I think it was corruption. I think it was cheating. But there's no evidence really to prove that yet, other than for some reason 500,000 more people suddenly voted in the gubernatorial election to make sure we could have as many townhouses and warehouses here. But I digress. But I think the UK is just a country's version of what's happening in New Jersey. You just have a corrupt government. The people who are corrupt are using the immigrants as a shield, essentially, and saying, well, you're a bunch of racists because you don't want umptillion immigrants in your town. Carl seems to be focusing, I think, a lot on the immigrants and how they change their country, which they do. And that's bad because they're not integrating. And I think he would agree it's fine to bring in immigrants legally and have them integrate in your society. But when they don't integrate, they create their own sort of little sub-societies within your country, and that can be very bad and is pretty bad now. The other thing is the grooming gangs, which he briefly mentions. The grooming gangs are obviously very illegal, and they're being protected. That's corruption. That's corruption. Now, you can argue it's the liberal world order, but it's not a liberal trait to ignore crime. It's just not. People are doing it for corrupt political reasons. The politicians don't want to deal with the fallout from the grooming gangs from their own policies. It's obviously a direct result of their policies, and they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to have to stop the flow of immigrants, and thus the flow of their money coming from whatever hedge fund. Again, it's probably a lot of different companies. I mean, you have companies building housing, which is a quick way to drive up the GDP, to drive up, because you build new houses. When you build new houses, the property values go up because the houses are new. Generally, when they first build them, they're nice. And people are going to move in and flood the tax base is the idea, right? So in a town here called Sicklerville, they're just wiping out all the farms, and they're building townhouses and apartment complex, and they're brand new. And when they're first new and you jam in another 300 people there or 600 people there, what you have are working people who immediately raise the tax base, right? Because all those people start paying taxes. The landlord are the ones who pay the property taxes, which is supposed to go to the schools, because a lot of those people have children, and then they go to the schools, right? The problem is it overburdens that area with too many people. And eventually, the school system starts to run down because you're also flooding the school with a bunch of new people in a very small space, right? There's only so many classrooms and seats in the classroom to accommodate all these kids. And even though the landlords are paying the property taxes which fund the schools, they are saving money because they're not paying as much property tax as the amount of people who live there if they had their own individual houses and paid property taxes, right? So I don't know how it would break down monetarily, but let's just say the landlord's paying $100K in property taxes for 600 people or 600 families, let's say. A lot of those would be single people, but let's say half of it. Let's say 300 are families with kids. If those 300 families had their own houses and paid their own taxes, it would be more like, I don't know, $400,000 in property taxes a month that would go to the schools, which would be a lot more money to pay for teachers or whatever. So you're overburdening the system purposely to make money. And the guy making money is the landlord because he's getting a lot of rent. The politicians now have more people to tax because there is now a bigger tax base, even though there's not enough for the schools. There are all these people who are living there paying state tax and paying, other bills and paying property taxes. More businesses open up, then they pay taxes and fees and whatever. And this is all local state government kind of stuff or town level stuff. The same thing applies in the UK, only on a bigger scale with a slightly different system. You flood the country with immigrants and you give them gibs or whatever. Now those people, I don't think they're paying taxes directly, but they're buying stuff, right? And their influx causes more businesses to open. Not a lot. I mean, some of the businesses have closed because of the degradation the immigrants have caused, because there's too many of them and there's lots of crime, but they're still paying into the system, and it's like a quick way to beef up the GDP. But it's a loss. It's a loss in the long run, because as you jam in too many immigrants and they sort of ghettoize parts of the UK, businesses close. So the response is to do the quickest, fastest thing by the corrupt politicians is to get more people in. So more businesses open and more people will vote for you. And it all doesn't matter as long as you're reelected, right? But that's also backfiring too, because you have people in the UK from these countries that, just like here, are now running for government. Like we had the Somali guy run for Minnesota. He didn't get elected though, thank God. But he only didn't get elected because the Somali tribal stuff is still going on in Minnesota. So one tribe wouldn't vote for the other, and he didn't get elected. But Mamdani did. And Mamdani is, I guess he's a legal immigrant, although there's some question about that. And so now he's going to run, New York City into the ground as a communist moron. And that's not good. But is that liberalism? Well, one could argue that it was liberalism that led people to vote for Mamdani, right? Because the liberals, say, oh, we gotta vote for a Democrat, the most left-leaning Democrats. We gotta try socialism. That was a project of the Marxists in our school system. Those people aren't liberals; they're Marxist, and the Marxists say anything you can to get in power, then get in power, and then we're gonna F everything up. Some of those people are in the UK system. Quite a few, I gather from some of the politicians I've seen and some of the clips Carl and Paul Joseph Watson show on their videos. So that's a corruption. The Marxists are corrupt politicians by nature. I mean, they literally lie. And some of these Muslim, politicians and people are very corrupt too, and very Marxist in their own way. Although more of it's, I think, driven by religion for some of them. So, is that the fault of liberalism? You know, the idea that you could have a representative government and freedom to do what you want and be with your family, all that stuff. You know, the Islamic guys, they're all about family. They just have a completely different sort of concept of it, but they got families, all right. They love having kids, and they have, you know, marriages and whatnot. But they're like very old school. I mean, they're like, you know, biblical levels of old school. Yeah, and they have tons of kids, so they're not anti-family. You know, Carl's like, well, the liberals are anti-family in his own way. Again, I'm, you know, rounded corners here in my discussion, and that the liberal project wants to atomize people. No, I would say that that's the Marxist want to atomize people, and the statist want to atomize people. You know, when you look at the founding fathers here in America, they were very liberal. They wanted life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But they also wanted laws. The grooming gangs are not part of that. They break the law. Jamming your country full of immigrants because corrupt politicians are making money off of them that's not legal, and that's not part of the liberal philosophy. One could argue that the liberals are very much in favor of that, partly because of that, but they are being dragged by the media and the Marxists in the educational system in order to come to that conclusion. People going to the protest, at least in America, you know, that hold up anti-Trump signs, they don't even know what the policies are. They don't even know why they're protesting Trump. That's a failure of in my view, the school system, which here has been completely overrun by Marxists. I mean, it's ridiculous. The teachers union has a stranglehold. However, it has been going on for a long time that even when I was in school, I learned despite the educational system. I learned despite some of my teachers and their philosophies. And I think a lot of people do that. In fact, when I got to college, I had a really good professor that says most of what, you know, actually learning things involves you unlearning the stuff you learned in high school. And I didn't really understand that when he said that at the time, but now I do. Yeah, now I get it. I had to unlearn a lot of stuff. So, yeah, this critique of liberalism and this idea, well, we're going into a post-liberal thing, like, I don't understand what that means. Like, I don't understand what he's articulating other than, well, we got to abandon what we did before because that didn't work. And I don't think you have to abandon the concept of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and representative government. I don't think we need a government that's going to say, okay, you know, you can't act in certain ways, you know, philosophically, or you're not a citizen or anything like that. I think you need to go after your corrupt politicians and kick them out, drain the swamp, as it were. And you got a big swamp in the UK, so I don't envy that thing. And it may cause a civil war amongst the English. And part of that is, and I think one of the reasons the United States hasn't fallen that far, is because we have guns. We have guns, and our government, still to this day, is a little afraid of us. Now, Carl cites some of the crime here. That's unfortunately sort of the result of having a more free society. We're always going to have more crime. We're always going to have more gun crime. Now, the stats here are also, corrupted, especially during the Biden admin and before. There was a whole lot of crime stats that had been fudged, especially by the FBI. So don't go completely by them, but there is crime here. But we also have a reputation for a lot of gun crime that is undeserved. So, for instance, I had dated this girl in Canada years ago, and she asked me, one of the questions she asked me, she was coming to visit, she said, "Do you own a gun?" And I said, well, I don't want to tell you what I said, but at the time I did not own a gun, I'll say. This was like over 20 years ago. And she was surprised, like, "Oh, you don't?" And then she asked me about the crime. And I was just like, well, we have normal levels of crime, which was the only thing I could say. And she was convinced that it was like a shooting gallery down here in America because she was from Canada. And there were differences, don't get me wrong. Our news reported on shootings every day in Philadelphia, where shootings happen almost every other day. Between Philadelphia and Camden, there'll probably be a shooting of some kind. But they're crime-ridden democratic cities, leftist hellholes, essentially. Whereas in Canada, at the time, in Toronto, I went up to visit her, and the only gun crime was a guy who had been shot 3 years ago, and they were still talking about it on the news. And I was like, that's weird. Why are they talking about this guy? Was he famous? And she went, no, he was shot. And I go, yeah, but who was shot today? She said, no one. The last person shot was shot 3 years ago. And I thought that was weird. But you can see the kind of government Canada has. It's just going to run you over. Because you guys don't have the same sort of gun situation. They can't just run over us here in the United States. So that keeps us from going completely cuckoo bananas with our government. You can only do so much before people are gonna go, hey, you better stop doing this, Sess. So I think that's part of the problem. I think when Carl's side gets back in the power, assuming they don't fall into something darker, and I am worried, like James Lindsay, they may be heading down a dark path if they're not careful. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean just because they're talking about post-liberalism, they won't eventually get into power and come to the same conclusions. Oh, we can't be that extreme. We have to, change the government in increments. Hopefully, they institute, a First Amendment and a Second Amendment and some of the stuff we have here, because I think that would help them. It would help them ensconce protections so their government it won't be free from corruption. Obviously, we have lots of corruption here in New Jersey. But it will limit the corruption to some degree, especially in their case, the federal level, from, jamming the whole country full of immigrants. I think that would help. And it would also help to use the legal system to go after not just the grooming gangs, but the people who protected them. Because those people should be in prison, in my view. Anyone who would protect a grooming gang should be in prison, and, the people who are in the grooming gang obviously should be in prison forever. Now, I don't believe in capital punishment. Carl does. It's his country. They want to hang them all. Well, that's probably what they'll do. But I think once you get your government back on track, you oust the globalist, which is, I think, probably inevitable. They're going to have some sort of civil strife in order to achieve that. One of the things that has hurt America, and I think has hurt the UK, is the lack of civics lessons. In the United States, we used to teach civics. And civics was, here's how the government works. Here's how the laws work. Here's how, you have a job and you pay the taxes, and then the government does X, Y, and Z, and that's how it all works. I had a lot of civics when I was growing up, partly because some of it was taught in school, but partly because I was a Boy Scout and I got the civics badge. So I knew all the civic stuff. And a lot of people just aren't taught that today. Again, that goes back to the corruption of the schools by the Marxists. So I think if you institute civics again, so people understood how the government works, they function better as people regardless of their politics, because they understand what the rules are. And when you understand what the rules are, you don't get frustrated and go down dark political paths like extreme leftism or extreme rightism. You just don't go down that path, because you go, well, no, that's not how the government works. I don't like this policy, but I'm going to elect a new guy so he reverses it. Or, well, that's a policy, but according to the Constitution, that sort of conflicts with certain things. So I'm not going to listen to that particular law, and I'm going to take him to court, which is something people can do here, and I believe they can do it in their own way in the UK. So I think a lot of the problems, aren't philosophical per se, and a lot of people they don't think about their personal philosophies when they do things, right? I don't think it drives every aspect of civilization. One of the things he talked about was apparently in UK pubs, they would allow teenagers to come in sometimes and order a pint, as long as they didn't get out of control with their beer drinking, right? There's really, I don't know if there's anything comparable in the United States to that. I would say the only thing comparable would be something like, when you're a teenager, you somehow get some beers, you steal them from your parents, or maybe you would hire an older guy to go into the liquor store to get you a case of beer, right? And what Carl said is the liberal world order said, oh, no, that's illegal. You can't do that, and we're going to prosecute people for it. Well, it is illegal, number one. And the question is, do you want that law changed? I don't want people thrown in prison because they gave their kid a beer. But at the same time, alcoholism is a thing, and sometimes some teenagers don't know what they're getting into, and they become alcoholics in high school. I mean, I remember a problem in high school where they had a couple of kids in my high school that were alcoholics. So, yeah, I mean, that can be a problem. There's a balance. And that's what I wanted to get out in this video. There's a balance to be had between people on the left and right. And again, I think there's a lot of different layers to philosophies and politics. I think there's a balance to be had that's very centrist, where, yes, you don't want people to be atomized, degenerates, dependent upon the state. And that, to me, is communism and Marxism. That's like the end of the left spectrum. But you also don't want people to live in this hyper-regulated traditional world where they have to go to church and they have to have a family and they have to have 2 kids and they have to work at a certain place. The compromise is in the middle, and the liberty is being within the spectrum that everybody can live with, right? So I don't want, call to prayer sirens going off on my neighborhood either. But there's a middle ground somewhere in there, right? And the middle ground would be like, if they built a mosque in my neighborhood, instead of the call to prayer going off all over the neighborhood, modern technology would say, okay, you can't have that, because the township would be like, oh no, you can't have the call to prayer, because people will sue us over that noise, and we will have to take the whole mosque. I forget what they call it. The mosque siren, I call it. So instead, modern technology would, for instance, send an alert to the Muslim's phone and then the call to prayer siren will go off on their phone. They'd be like, oh, it's prayer time. I have to pray to Mecca. Which wouldn't bother anybody but the person who wants to be bothered, right? And so that's the compromise for living in a liberal small L society. So you have the freedom to practice your religion, being a Muslim, but you're not bothering other people who aren't Muslim, which is going to be an issue in the coming years, especially in a place like Paterson, New Jersey, which got taken over by a lot of Muslim immigrants who are now taking over the government. But they're also politicians, right? And they may be corrupted by the fact, like, well, we got a lot of Muslims here, and I'm going to be a Muslim guy, and I'm just going to do everything for the Muslims. That's not representing all your constituents. That's just representing the Muslim ones. And that's a form of corruption. And that needs to be addressed eventually. Like, you know, if it doesn't get too out of control, obviously that's going to be the case. You know, if you've got a community that's 70% Muslim, it's going to be a problem if everybody, all the non-Muslims move out, right? And a lot of the businesses move out, and the Muslims maybe don't have the infrastructure to take them over, and now you've got a problem where you don't have you know, an auto shop place or a grocery store, and you got to go out further and further out to get the stuff you need in your community. And it's like, you know, the Muslims are going to start complaining, well, why don't we have an auto parts store or whatever? And you know, the response to politicians is like, well, you know, you won't stop you won't stop with all the Muslim stuff, and they don't like that. And then you had to come up to some sort of compromise, let's say. So there's a compromise, and that's what politicians do. They're there to make the compromise, and typically everybody's pissed off by that compromise, right? So the Muslim call to prayer, guys, I don't like getting the alerts on my phone. That's not traditional Muslim siren. And then, you know, the modern guys are like, well, it's not bothering me anymore. I don't like, you know, even hearing it go off on your phone. I don't like the look of a mosque. I'd rather have a church there. Like, you got to have a compromise so people can live together. And if you can't have that compromise, if you're one of those hard-line people who don't want the compromise, well, then your other option is to move or go to a country where, okay, they're super traditional, I guess. But the problems wouldn't even have happened if the government was functioning properly. Because if your government was functioning properly, they wouldn't have let all these immigrants in to begin with. And if you finally get your Trumpian figure, now he thinks it won't be Nigel Farage. It might be. Nigel may say, in order to stay in power and keep the money flowing, I now have a way to make money by kicking everybody out of the country. So he may be corrupt the other way, like, oh, we're going to make some money. And that may very well be happening here. Because, again, the mechanisms behind the scenes, the people in power, they're always looking to make money on their power. That's why they're in power. So I'm sure, and I've heard rumors that, you know, for instance, there was this guy who made the patches for the TSA, right? And he made all these crazy patches, and apparently he's a millionaire because all he does is he makes the patches for the TSA, and he got that contract. Well, I'm sure there's a guy who already bid for the patches for the Border Patrol guys, and the uniforms, and the helmets, and the mask, and all the other stuff they have to supply the Border Patrol. And I'm sure it's worth millions and millions of dollars. And now that they're recruiting hundreds of thousands of Border Patrol agents to kick you know, illegal immigrants out of this country, it's a growing business. So that could very well, and probably is already, becoming corrupt, right? And it could reach the point, the pendulum probably go the other way, that, you know, we kick out, let's say, I don't know, out of the estimate, I think is 30 million immigrants. I think by the end of Trump's first year, we might have kicked out 1 million. It might be sometime, I don't know, towards the end of let's say a second J.D. Vance administration. We've kicked out 25 million immigrants, right? But now we're down to the last, let's say, 5 million immigrants, and these people have really been here a long time. These people are like genuinely have escaped something from their home countries and genuinely have refugees. But the big business of kicking illegal immigrants out of the country, they want to sustain that. So you might have a situation in which those organizations who fund the border patrol stuff want that to continue somehow. So they push for legislation. Yeah, let's kick those people out. Yeah, your country's fine now. You can go back to it. And that would be, again, the corruption of the system. And you would need the pendulum to sort of swing back towards the middle and say, okay, we kicked enough illegal immigrants out. The rest are mostly cool because they were escaping hardship. So we gotta slow this down back to levels, and we're gonna have to let people go. And your various contract for the patches and masks for the border patrol guys, well, that's gonna have to be less money now. You have to find a new business. In America, those new old businesses don't go down without a fight, because if they could just get another year's worth of funding, I made my $1 million. So that's the corruption of government. And your government is very corrupt the other way. They're bringing in tons and tons of immigrants. And I promise you, there are many people in your upper echelons in your government and their supporters making millions and millions of pounds off these immigrants. Whether they're supplying them with food, shelter. I mean, look at the hotel guys. The hotel guys are making huge bank. You have some dingy ass hotel nobody wants to stay in the middle of nowhere, in a place nobody vacations at. Well, suddenly it's full to capacity 24/7 for the next 10 years because you jammed it full of immigrants, and you're making literally millions of pounds. That's why this is happening to an extent. I don't think it's a philosophy. I think it's about money and corruption. And that's what you need to root out. You need to kick all these politicians out of office. And that's going to be very, very hard, because I think almost all of them are in on it. So, and that's the problem here. And thankfully, we have Trump. I hope you get a Trump soon, Carl. I really do. And that's it for me, Tony D, and Little Joan, asleep in the sunbeam. I hope my video was enlightening, or at least not confusing. I will be doing the live stream today at 7. Hope to see you there. See you in the next one.